you so much. As Henry VIII said to each of his wives, I will not be keeping you here for long. I want to thank you, first of all, for braving the weather, and to say that I look forward to our question and answer period. I will need lots of time for that, because I often find that to be the most productive way of exchanging thoughts and ideas. The ancient Greeks had a word that is untranslatable. The word is paideia. It meant a space or a topology of education, and it was used to refer to their polis, to their city, where that city was what they would consider to be well constituted. That meant that the education of citizens, which began in the home and in the schools, extended through their lifetime in their service as jurors, in their service as members of the assembly, citizens, in their role as audiences in front of the great tragedies and comedies of Greek culture, in their deaths through the stones that memorialized their lives and became narrative for the next generation. The entire way in which the life of Athens was considered, in the great words of Pericles, open to the world as an example to the world, was one that was influential through the centuries, and is, I think, captured in USNY, in the University of the State of New York's extraordinary role that was just so wonderfully outlined. A role that, frankly, is captured in no other State Department of Education. It is a humbling responsibility to imagine what that could look like. In the everyday maelstrom of life, it is about making sure that important regulation is followed, that important law is sustained, that a test is well designed, that support is given to an accountant who's trying to be certified, that there are a million small things that are not small to those involved, is the daily work of the department. But it is terribly easy in that daily work to lose sight of what the vision was, to look at that building and remember why it looks the way it does. It's not an accident, it's a Greek temple. It's not an accident that the murals up at the top of the second floor bring together the great innovations of American technology with the great mythologies of ancient Greece. One way to make this vivid is to imagine the result of proposing today that one would construct a building like this, right, to house state public education. Just to think about the shift in the vision that has happened between 1910, if you will, just to pick an arbitrary date, and 2010. What has happened to the public confidence in the public mission of democratic education? And I think I begin that way because I think there is something of a crisis in that vision. And I don't mean that in a silly, I hope, or cheap or facile way. There are always crises. There are budgetary crises. There are crises about race to the top. There are crises about, whether our tests are too predictable. Those are important issues we'll come back to. But more fundamentally, the question is being asked about the very purpose, status, quality of the vision of public education. And the bitter debate about charter schools is only, I think, an important manifestation of that underlying question. What are we about when we educate publicly the 3 million school children of New York, state, and of course across the country? I think there are powerful answers to that have gotten occluded or have become opaque, partly because of good intentions. And let me start there. There is currently a model of education reform. It has been, in part, created by think tanks, supported by Democrats for Education Reform. It is the accepted consensus, if you will, across the country. And not to be in sync with that consensus is to be regarded as a little silly, slightly Neanderthal, unsophisticated, don't we get it, right? And the model goes like this. You hold all primary actors, states, districts, schools, accountable for outcomes. You are somewhat impatient with inputs. Inputs are for small people. Outcomes are for serious people. Outcomes are about test results, fundamentally, and the use of those results to hold agents accountable. And the resources should follow the results. Essentially, they should go to places, institutions, people that deliver on those outcomes, and they should be removed, as soon as possible. Politics understood to be an intervening factor, labor laws understood to be an intervening factor, but largely they should be removed as rapidly as possible from those agencies, agents, institutions that fail to deliver on those outcomes. And frankly, there's not an enormous amount of patience with unpacking what those outcomes are. Because to do that would be, in fact, I suspect, to rapidly come to the conclusion that the outcomes are only as good as the inputs. Let me give you an example. We deeply believe in this country in measuring. Aristotle once said that you cannot ask of a given form of knowledge more measurement than that form of knowledge affords. Hamlet was confused because A, B, C, D were. I suspect that testing one's knowledge of Hamlet that way is possibly not the way that is going to get students excited about Hamlet. There's an outcome measure, and one of the options presumably might be, right, uncertainty of the ethics of killing versus a desire for revenge. That's option C. It might be the one you fill in the bubble about. But more fundamentally, the outcome will give you a score. And you can get that score up if you know how to teach some basics. The question is, has the student actually learned something valuable, right, in the process? So by defining outcomes in a way that makes them simple to calculate, cheaper to evaluate, you have in fact defined an input. You've actually said to yourself, we will not look at anything that we can't measure. We will not be able to afford, right, to do this, and therefore we won't do it. We will just stick with our outcome measure because we can afford it, we can measure it, and we can tell when it goes up or down. And we can hold people accountable. So questions that unpack the nature of that outcome tend to be uncomfortable questions. They're uncomfortable at multiple levels. They're uncomfortable financially. We are one of the few countries in the world, advanced industrialized countries, that rely so heavily on multiple choice testing. They are uncomfortable because they unpack intellectual divisions. Let me give an example. In most countries, industrialized countries, at the high school level, a literature course is capped by a national exam where there are essay questions, where students actually have to write hour-long essays, which is not entirely stupid, given that they're going to have to do it in college, right? And one might want to see some continuity. However, human beings have to grade those essays, and human beings are fallible. Moreover, essays tend to be about real things, like books you've read. So somebody has to pick the books. Now, most countries have no particular difficulty about that. They pick a list of 20 each year. The teacher picks the 5 she's passionate about. The student picks those 5 essay topics to write about, and somebody grades it. A human being, set of human beings, evaluating other human beings. Those with education, evaluating those with less. We, however, are deeply suspicious, very suspicious, of the human judgment capacity that involves, both in selecting the curriculum and in evaluating the result. So by sticking to a simple-minded outcome measure, we avoid that whole discussion. We just push it aside. The problem is that the single most interesting, important, vital part of education is what happens between a teacher and a student. And the nature of that interaction is unavoidably one that involves human judgment, and it involves content. It involves what we call a curriculum. We don't have a curriculum. What we've done is to design this thing from the output backwards. So, lots of energy on national core, common core standards. Now, $350 million investment by the feds in assessments. And curriculum, only small people talk about curriculum. In my view, this is actually backwards. And it partially explains, not completely, it partially explains our very poor performance internationally. What I mean by that is, when we look at TIMSS, Third International Math and Science Studies, when we look at PISA, what we find out is that students who come from countries that don't use bubble tests as much as we do, that do have a real national curriculum, that do train their teachers to teach that curriculum, and create their assessments on top of the curriculum, not the other way around, that though their students, paradoxically, do better on the bubble tests than ours do. It's very strange. If we use bubble tests, how come we're not good at it? Turns out that the questions don't look exactly the same as the questions that our students were prepared to take the bubble test on. They don't recognize that the story they're reading about in the math example is actually testing an equation. They know, because they didn't understand the equation in depth. They understood it just enough to answer the transparent question as an application of the equation. So, not only do they not do particularly well internationally, but much more seriously, it's not entirely clear what they know. And I mean that very in a profound way. We actually don't know very much about the level of their thinking and their skills, right? Because of this, in my view, inverted logic of how we've designed our thinking about education. Now, not for a moment do I think, and I'm getting to real brass tacks very quickly, I promise, not for a moment do I think that this is an either or. I actually believe in accountability. I don't know how one does a job if there's no accountability for how one does. I do believe that outcomes matter. It actually matters whether you can write a coherent essay. It matters whether you can design a scientific experiment. It matters if you know how to use the technologies of the century we live in. It matters that you can think creatively. It actually matters if you have memorized something beautiful and are of some interest to yourself as a result. It matters whether you are aware and able to enjoy the literacies of music and art, as well as of ELA and mathematics. These outcomes matter. But we, in this country, tend to go from one extreme to the other. So from an ed school extreme of constructivism, where the whole idea was not the sage on the stage, not even the guide on the side, but the peer in the rear, right? Where the model was, have you embraced a tree today? And if not, well, if that's your choice, it's fine, because authentic learning is everything, and it must come from the child. Between that and the multiple choice 40-question test, we lurch from one extreme to another. And in the process of lurching from one extreme to another, we miss, it seems to me, the fundamental responsibility of educators, which, as Hannah Arendt said, is to take responsibility for the what. The what that is going to be taught, right, to the next generation. What are we, in fact, responsible for teaching? That is called the curriculum. So, there is a vision that I've shared with the regents and that they have bravely supported and taken to another level. And that is a very, I think, strong sense that curriculum, professional development, and assessment are related to each other. And that we cannot continue to just pour hundreds of millions of dollars into fragmentary professional development, right? Weekend workshops, whatever it may be, when we don't have a curriculum. because the money that's wasted is wasted not through any fault of anybody, but because there's nothing really to focus on. You can't redesign professional development every week for what every teacher decides to do in her classroom. We have small districts that spend years designing curriculum, when there are world-class math curriculum right across the shelf. We could be spending those resources preparing teachers to teach a great curriculum. Imagine the analogy with an actor. You know, even the greatest actors, perhaps particularly the greatest actors, Laurence Olivier, a British example, it would be strange if they came to the stage one evening and said, whoops, I've got to write the play I'm about to act. But that's what we say to our teachers. Right? Teachers, by and large, and there are exceptions, and there are important exceptions, but by and large, when I talk to teachers, they want to teach. They don't want to, worry about whether it's the McGraw-Hill textbook or the Pearson textbook, or whether it's this curriculum or that curriculum, or nobody gave them a curriculum. They want to teach. That's why they're in the classroom. So, we believe that a content-rich, spiraled, sequenced curriculum is important. It's important for everything. It's important to prepare teachers before they enter the classroom. It's important for professional development. It's important for accountability. Assessment should be built on something, not the other way around. Right? Today, our assessments have become our curriculum, which they were never designed to be, and they're reductive as a result, and therefore the teaching is reductive. It's not the teacher's fault that teaching is the test. They don't have a curriculum except for the test, and the test is the curriculum. So we believe that curriculum is important, that assessments need to be intelligently designed, so that they actually assess the skills and knowledge that educated citizens should have. And we need to ask that question collectively as citizens. What is an educated citizen? I've never heard that question asked, ever, right? In all of my conversations in Washington, in New York, it's like this, it's something embarrassing about that question. As if, that's weird. What's an educated citizen? I mean, we spend $52 billion a year in this state on that question, and yet we won't ask it. There's something strange about it. Right? Let's ask the question, and then let's backward design our education to give us some reasonable possibility of getting to that result. Instead, we try to kind of build it from the ground up. It's like building a channel tunnel from France to England with no compass. Right? It's not surprising that we lose thousands and thousands of students, right? In big holes in that pipeline, because it was never backward designed from the destination. And that those holes are absolutely tragic. I mean, you know the data, and we've been sharing the data, but if you look at the 2002 ninth grade cohort, right, you might ask how many ELL students who were in ninth grade in 2002 are still in university, ought to be in the second year of any university education, community college, four-year college. And we all know in this audience, there's never been a greater economic return to every year of education. So it's never been more important to be in college. And we're only talking about second year. We're not talking about graduating, right, from that college. Basically, if there were 10 ELL students in that cohort, 2002 cohort, ninth grade, if there were 10 of you, 9 of you were gone. 9 of you were gone. And then, you know, the figures get marginally better as you look at other groups, but tragically dreadful. 1 out of 8 of you is left if you're an African American male. 1 out of 8 if you're Hispanic, and so forth. So we have not taken responsibility for a coherent vision of education in which curriculum, professional development, and assessment form a natural triangle that, in the view of almost every other country, is sort of like brushing your teeth. Right? How else could you imagine that you're going to build a reasonable education system. But because of the legacy of localism in this country, and there are important historical and cultural reasons for that, we don't even have 700 curriculum in this state in any given subject. We often have multiple curriculum in the same school, right? Let alone in the same district. So we feel in some ways that and I've had the privilege of working a little bit with the Secretary of Education on teacher preparation, and we are passionate about the fact, both of us, that teacher preparation should be clinically based, it should be based in experience in the schools, practice, 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 as Mark Gladwell would say. You can't become a great teacher by reading a textbook. You gotta keep at it. You gotta keep working at it under the guidance of master teachers. And we believe that. And we believe that you shouldn't be in a classroom unless you've shown us that you can actually perform in the classroom. So we want performance-based assessments. And we want the same thing for principals. So you can't become a great principal by reading a book and just marching along and thinking it will happen. So we want performance-based assessments for principals. All of that we agree completely. We believe in assessments. Right? One of the great religions of the world believes in the Last Judgment. And there's a point to that, right? It regulates the lives of the believers. However, where we part company a little bit is along the lines that I've just described. That is, we actually believe that all the professional development in the world, all the good training in the world, has to be about teaching something. Right? And we are not naive. We know that coming together around statewide curriculum is not a 2-minute drill. It's got cultural complications, political complications. But the arguments at an economic level, at an intellectual level, at an academic level seem to us to be compelling. The next level, if you will, beyond that triangle of curriculum and professional development, and really getting professional development right, and saying that it is about practice and conveying rich material in an exciting and engaging way. It's about communication skills, not just about pedagogical textbooks, is the assessment. Now, the federal government is supporting this big assessment move in English and math. And it will be critical that not be an excuse to just create more bad assessments, right? That not just an exercise in enabling you to compare a student's performance in New York State with a student's performance in Hong Kong, or perhaps with Texas. Those are good goals. Absolutely for transparency. We ought to know how we're doing vis-a-vis other folks in this country and other countries in the world. But let's not make that the goal, right? The goal, we can't do this one more time of going for something that gives us a statistic, but covers up from us any knowledge of whether what we're evaluating is worth evaluating. So we have a responsibility to try to ensure that our next generation assessments actually assess complex skills. That as we move up the age bands, we move from your ability to decipher phonics, let's say, to your capacity to write not the 5-paragraph essay, right, but the 5-hour essay. A couple of years ago in France, I'm not suggesting the French model is without its serious faults, just in case anyone worries. But a few years ago in France, every school child graduating from high school interested in going on to university had to take the general paper of the bac. And they had to write for 4 hours with no notes on the following question. What would persuade you that rocks feel pain? Now, I just ask you for a moment to indulge in a thought experiment. Imagine a classroom of our 17-year-olds with a pen, a blank, right, pieces of paper in front of them with lines, horizontal lines so they can write. Writing for 4 hours on an abstract question like that. Now, you may not think that's your definition of an educated person, and I respect that. Let's at least have that discussion. Our students could not do that way. I suspect, after half an hour. Right? They would not know how to assemble the scientific, the theoretic, the literary, the allegorical, the mythical, the historical, and weave it into a compelling essay on that question. And again, you may think, well, thank goodness, I don't want my 17-year-olds, with that set of skills. We can argue about that, but let's at least have that argument. So, we have a lot to do to ensure that assessments are worth teaching to. You're always going to teach to an assessment, just like, again, for a religious person who's a Christian, in some ways going to live towards the Last Judgment. The point is whether the assessment's worth living to. And if it's a demanding, deep, engaging assessment that actually asks us to do things that are meaningful before we go on to college, and that actually might link into college, or it's an assessment that really says you've got the technical and vocational skills you need to succeed in this workplace, not last century's. And by the way, you've shown us you're strong in English and math. That might be a high school graduation route worth defending as well. And I'm very pleased that the Regents, in this guise, have announced and started to work in March, a key senior work group, the Regents working group, on college and career readiness. They're raising this fundamental question of what does that mean? Then, which is brave because this state was famous for putting in that single region standard, right? 65 on 5 regions. And the regions are courageously asking the question, is that what we mean by an educated citizen? Does it serve our young people? Right? Does it challenge them and give them options and so on? These are not easy questions to ask. It's much easier just to say, well, we got our 65 score on 5 tests. That's what we mean by educated. And here's the percentage, of people who made it. And if that goes up, we're educating more people. Maybe. Maybe not. Could any of you actually give me a coherent, in-depth defense of 5 scores of 65 really representing a young person who's educated? I don't know. I have some questions. So, good answers, I think is what I'm trying to say. Good answers come from good questions. And the degree to which we're lazy about this and just keep staring at numbers and have agonies if they're flat and celebrations if they go up, and then we don't really believe them anyway. I mean, that I think is the ultimate problem. And this is not just true of America. Whenever a country adopts a kind of examination or assessment that has the same shape as we do, they have the same agony, right? What happens is that this test results start going like this. Because, by definition, if they don't grapple with things that are immensely complex and difficult, they are things you can teach to. And it's a reasonable thing to do, I repeat, to teach to an assessment. So, we go through this annual agony, right? Do our state test results? Are they reliable? Are they meaningful? What about NAEP, when NAEP is flat and the state tests are going this way? And everyone is the worse off for those. Those are not good questions, right? They're not questions about what the substance of learning. They're questions about econometrics. They're questions about test design and cut scores and weightings and you name it. We have a conversation among technical experts, not a conversation among citizens. Something is going wrong. So, I guess, bottom line, I'm deeply aware of the massive budgetary challenges right now. We are 9% of the state education department supported by the state. We will be at 7% if the current executive budget goes through. We are not a state agency financially. We are a federal agency financially. We are looking at, like many other citizens in many other guises of life in this country, very serious cuts. 30% to our basic state operating budget on the state in the last 3 years. The cuts go through. We have major challenges as a result. But the paradox is that at the same moment we have a federal government that has never had more dollars coming out of education, and that is willing to use them restrictively, and has a very, very consistent message. And it's, in my view, it's partly right. It's partly right. It's right that we should hold ourselves accountable. It's right that we should not have very, very poor teachers teaching forever in our classrooms. It's right that we should give opportunities to our master teachers to enable them to use their skills to help novice teachers. It's right about a lot of things. It's just that there are questions it won't ask. And those questions seem to be essential. And those questions seem to be must be asked at the same moment as we use those federal dollars, as we must, to advance our assessment regime, to advance our professional development of teachers, our training of teachers and principals, our reward systems. You know the data systems, right? I mean, we may need $150 million investment in data in the state for education. We should have that investment. We should have good data tracking of students and teachers, course identifiers, and be able to do value added. But again, value added of what? Let's not make a fetish of the numbers game. Let's always force ourselves to ask the more difficult question of what are the numbers for? Because otherwise, what are we really? So there's much else we could talk about. There's so many challenges, and I'm only too well aware of how many things I've left out. Turning around lowest performing schools, the challenges we have there, the legal environment we work in, the whole question of the relationship of online courses and remote learning to the workforce and our teachers and the shifting parameters of learning, the whole question of the relationship between value added and employment. And these are real issues, and I have enormous patience and fascination for them, but not in isolation, right? Not as if they were ends in themselves, not as if they were somehow the answer. Because, and I'll close with this, if you read Tyack and Cuban's Tinkering Towards Utopia, if I could recommend one short book on the history of American education, that would be it. What they show is a very disturbing pattern in this country. A pattern of moving the pendulum from one extreme to the other. And the result is sort of like if you're in a bathtub and you push the water one way and then the wave comes back and you push against it, right? I don't know if you ever did that as a child. I certainly did. The result is chaos, right? It's chaos in the bathtub, which was the point. Right? But you don't necessarily want that in education, right? Just as you're swinging from one extreme to the other, right? The previous reform is just getting going, right? And then, boom, right back it comes, and we have chaos. To her credit, Diane Ravitch, in her recently written book, actually charts that movement in her own thinking, and sort of shows that someone, after all, was a senior official in the Bush administration and is now, a very avowed opponent of some of the accountability and testing measures that we've been talking about. And you can see that pendulum move even in the thinking of one of our smarter commentators on education. So my invitation to you is to begin a conversation about what an educated person is. To be tough-minded on all of this accountability, testing, professional development, teacher ed, the whole works. Never ever confuse the courage to ask tough questions with being soft. We've got to get past this either or. We've got to have an intelligent conversation about education. Thank you so much.